Is it just me, or does it feel like stand up comedy is getting worse as a whole as time goes on? This is going to be a pretty tough video for me to make because I'm going to have to be critical of some people that I'm a pretty big fan of, both as comedians and seemingly as people, as well as an art form that I truly admire. Stand-up comedy has been one of my favorite forms of entertainment since I was a kid.
I'm a little boy.
Some of the first stand-up specials I can ever remember watching were Stephen Wright's 1985 special, Louis Anderson's Louis in St. Louis, and Martin Lawrence's You So Crazy, which I was probably a little too young to have watched it when I did, but here we are. These are three very different stand-up specials from three very different comedians that all resonated with me in their own way. One of the really cool things about stand-up comedy is that you get to learn so much about people and how they think, how people from different cultures view the world and experience life, and how that differs from how you may view the world and experience life. You're given so many opportunities to reflect on a different perspective, a different take on a particular topic that maybe you haven't considered before, or maybe even realize you're not alone in something you already think or do. I remember when I was very young, I was hitting a point where I was starting to understand that being a real man was going to be something that was probably going to be expected of me in society as I got older. And worrying at times that maybe I wasn't going to be manly enough, or maybe I didn't have anything in common with the traditional man's man. And then I saw Tim Allen's special called All Men Are Pigs, where he talks about a lot of the things that men do, like kick their underwear up off their foot and try to catch it on the first try, or spin the bread and tuck it under instead of using the twist tie to close it back up. And it put me at ease a little bit about if I had any hope of being a man when I grew up. Of course, you get older and realize that's all silly bullshit anyway, but the point still stands. Stand-up comedy is amazing. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what your background is, what kind of life you've lived. If you can get up on stage and make it funny, you can be successful. Clean, dirty, political, silly, random, musical, props, doesn't matter. Learn how to make it funny, and you can make it. I've listened to so much stand-up over the years. I used to go on road trips that were 8 hours plus and only listen to stand-up comedy. You'd have the Sirius XM radio station you'd get when you'd rent a car, and I'd put it on the stand-up comedy station and just leave it there. I used to preload stand-up specials on my Spotify before I would go on a flight so that I would have stand-up to listen to on the flight. I think in a lot of ways it helped me learn to observe and interpret what was going on around me instead of just reacting to it and actively listen to what people are saying. Many comedians get on stage and tell stories about their life experience and their opinions on things. And while they do work to make these things funny, they're also often interesting, reasonable takes on a lot of the polarizing issues in society. I say all of this to say I'm not your average fan of stand-up comedy, and I found myself asking, what's happening to stand-up? I can't speak for anyone else, but I certainly feel like stand-up comedy as a whole has been on the decline the last few years. To be crystal clear, I'm not saying there are no funny comedians and that there are no good specials, but I have found myself more often than not lately disappointed when I watch a new special. Perhaps the most recent and extreme example of this, and it literally physically pains me to have to say this, but it's Mark Normand's latest special, Soup to Nuts. Let me clear this up before we get into this. I am such a big fan of Mark Normand. I have been listening to Mark Normand since long before he was popping up everywhere. I'm a huge fan. I'm so excited that he has found success. I think it is very well deserved. I remember one night when I was still living in New York, we went to I think it was the Cellar, and Mark Normand ended up being there. He was closing it out unexpectedly. And I was so excited, and the people I was with had no idea why I was so excited. I was like, this dude is so good. It's so cool to get to see him live. You guys are going to love him. Obviously, he killed. I think Mark Normand is a fantastic comedian and almost always is hilarious. I've never watched him and not thought he was hilarious until I watched this special. The first time I tried to watch it, I actually made it about 20 minutes before I gave up and turned on something else. I did go back and finish it eventually, but I barely laughed at all. And I'm not a difficult laugh. I never go into anything with my arms folded like, make me laugh, funny guy. I'm never skeptical. Even with a comedian I don't know, I don't go in with that attitude. But especially with one I already know and there's some rapport and familiarity with and admiration for, I'm ready to go in and laugh. I'm not expecting not to laugh. I don't have any crazy expectations. I just expect that he'll be funny in the same way that I would expect to get wet if I jumped into a pool. It was a strange experience not laughing at his special, and even stranger getting to the point where I felt like I had to watch something else. Another example is John Mulaney. Again, let me be very clear with you. He's an easy top 10er for me in the list of favorites. We could argue top 5 potentially. I am a big John Mulaney fan. I've been listening to him for years. He's actually one of 2 comedians that I ever actually purchased physical copies of their work to have. The other one was Dane Cook. John had a special back in the day called New in Town, and I had it on DVD. New in Town is about as perfect as a stand-up special gets, in my opinion. It seems like it's perfectly shot, it's perfectly timed, his pacing is excellent, his delivery is excellent, the jokes are well ordered, the crowd was good, the set was good. It's just one of those where it all came together and just feels like it couldn't have been better. In my opinion, it's a masterpiece of a stand-up special. After New in Town came The Comeback Kid and Kid Gorgeous, which weren't bad specials by any stretch of the imagination, but in my opinion, they're not even close to New in Town. And by all accounts, everyone I've spoken to has a similar sentiment. They think that those specials are not as funny as his older stuff. I'll even say I think his first special, which is called The Top Part, which if you haven't heard, you should go look up. I think that's better than both of those specials. I will say Baby J, his most recent one, was his best one since New in Town. So that was really cool to see. I also just want to take a moment to try to again be very clear and articulate the point of the video. This video is not about the decline of any particular comedian. I just find it very difficult to illustrate the point I'm trying to make here without giving some examples. So I'm intentionally using examples of comedians that I think very highly of to ensure that I'm not going into it with a bias. I'm simply talking about what seems to be a broad theme across stand-up comedy as a whole over the last few years. I also understand why it could be very offensive to have someone compare your new work to your old work in this way. But again, I'm struggling to articulate what I'm trying to say without giving examples. So basically what I'm trying to say is, John Mulaney, if you're watching this, and I know that you probably are, please don't hate me, I love you, and I'm glad you're doing better with the cocaine stuff now. There are plenty of comedians I could talk about in this section to further my point, but at the risk of offending any more of my comedy heroes, I think it's best we move on. I will also say there are a small few comedians that I think are exempt here. One example of this exception would be Louis C.K., and I think he's a really interesting one to talk about here because I can specifically point to certain things that are in contrast with some of the other comedians that are not exceptions, and we'll get to those shortly. I've given a lot of thought to why I might feel like stand-up comedy is declining, and why all the people that I've talked to about this feel similarly. The easy answer that I think a lot of people are going to want to jump to immediately is that society has become too woke, and that comedians can't tell jokes anymore for fear of being canceled. But I don't think that's it. There are plenty of comedians who push boundaries and get away with it because they're funny. Shane Gillis is perhaps the best example of this, and arguably the best active comedian right now.
I think it's fair to say that of all the presidents we've had, I think it's fair to say that Trump would have been the funniest one to see get shot.
The reason he gets away with it is because he's funny. There's a difference in making jokes about something people find sensitive and using jokes as an excuse to be mean. And people can very easily tell the difference. Shane does an excellent job frequently of navigating very sensitive topics in a very funny way, and it's clear he has no negative intentions, which is why for the most part he gets away with it. Anthony Jeselnik would be another good example of this.
Have you ever dropped a baby?
Another possible reason, and perhaps much more likely, is overexposure. We're simply getting too much of these comedians on a regular basis. So many comedians now have podcasts, solo podcasts, duo podcasts, are constantly going on each other's podcast, and so on and so on. It seems like every day of the week, there's a new episode of at least one podcast, and it's probably got one of your favorite comedians on it. And that's not intrinsically a bad thing. I enjoy a lot of these podcasts on a very regular basis. It's really cool to see these people in a more realistic setting, engaging in real conversation, playing it up a little, of course, but for the most part, genuine, organic conversation, and potentially being more themselves than maybe they are on stage. Could be a double-edged sword, though. By seeing these people several times a week for years, by the time they get on stage to tell jokes, it's not entirely unlikely we've heard some version of these jokes before. Or perhaps just even seen a little too much of the comedian themselves. Maybe their onstage persona is a little different than how they actually are, so now it feels weird or artificial to see them on stage. There's also the possibility that someone is maybe funnier off stage than they are on stage. Let's take Theo Von, for example. I think Theo Von is fine as a stand-up comedian. On stage, he's funny enough. I'm happy to sit through any special he does. I've watched most of them that are available to me. I cannot remember one joke he's ever told on stage. I laugh a few times throughout. Again, I enjoy it. It's fine. Theo Von in a podcast setting, however, arguably the funniest in the game.
You need a smoothie, Melissa. You're fucking losing your shit.
He's so off the wall and random and weird and funny and genuine when he's free to just do whatever comes to him organically, that now when I see him on stage trying to stick to a set he's committed to, it doesn't feel the same. And I'm less entertained than I might have been because now I know this different version of him that I think is much funnier. Think about how it used to be before all of the podcast and huge social media presences. Tom Segura would drop a special, and then you wouldn't really have any idea what he was doing until he dropped another special. Now he's got multiple podcasts and internet shows he does, posts on multiple social media platforms on a very regular basis, is basically always in your feed. And I'm not saying Tom Segura is not still great on stage, but it feels different now. It's much closer to watching someone you already know get on stage and do comedy than it is to watching a comedian who you know very little about because you only know from their onstage persona get on stage and tell a bunch of jokes that you've completely never heard before, that you're completely unfamiliar with. Again, back to Louis C.K. Even aside from his self-inflicted year or two off, he doesn't really do a lot. You don't see much of him. He had a TV show for a while. He does a couple of other projects here and there, but unless he's doing a quick round of podcasting to promote a new special, you don't hear a ton from him. So this feeling that stand-up comedy is generally on the decline could simply be a case of too much of a good thing. To kind of piggyback on this notion, I've also considered that maybe there just isn't the same sense of urgency that there once was to be funny on stage. Having these successful podcasts and all the brand deals that come with that, along with the exposure and other opportunities, it's certainly understandable that stand-up comedy would take a back seat. It takes a lot to get up on stage every night and hammer out every detail of an individual joke to try to perfect it. Tour around the country and or world sometimes. Eating shitty food, sleeping in shitty hotels, dealing with shitty crowds, being away from home, being tired, being away from all the other things that you're doing that are successful. That's a lot. That's a lot for stand-up comedy. But there was a time where they didn't really have that choice. If you wanted to pay your bills, you had to do these things because being good on stage was the top priority. Because if you weren't good on stage, these opportunities would get taken away from you. Now, they're going to sell out shows regardless. They have such massive audiences on these social media platforms that only continue to grow that it's become far less important that they kill every time they get on stage. Tom Segura can deliver a completely average performance on stage now, and everybody that went to see him will be thrilled that they got to see him. So why would he need to put all that energy into killing? In my opinion, Tom Segura has never been funnier on stage than he was in his special called Completely Normal. I don't think I stopped laughing at all for the first half of it. It's crazy funny. And again, let me be clear. I'm not saying his recent specials are bad. I'm not saying any of these people's specials are bad, except Soup to Nuts. Sorry, Mark. I'm just saying that kind of as a whole, stand-up comedy specials seem to be trending downward in how funny they are. And it's really kind of a bummer to watch as someone who's such a big fan of it. I don't really know what the point of this video was, to be honest. It's just something I've been thinking about for a while and I thought was interesting. And that's kind of what I want to do on this channel, is just make videos about things that I think are interesting or funny. So here we are. My big hope is that this came across as intended and not overly critical or mean to anyone that I did talk about in this video. Any comedian that I brought up in this video, I'm a huge fan of, and I hope that that is evident. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you're new here and want to check out more of what I do, you can subscribe or just visit the channel and see if there's anything that makes you want to subscribe. I tend to try to be a little bit funnier than I was in this video, but again, I wanted to try something new, so get off my back about it. One thing I'm going to do is, as this video ends, I'm going to leave you with a list of comedy specials over the years that I think are really good and worth checking out, and maybe a little bit less mainstream than like Louis C.K. or Kevin Hart or some of the big names that you probably know, even if you're not a big fan of comedy. I'm going to try to leave you with a list of some that are maybe a little bit more niche if you're interested in checking out stand-up comedy and getting into some specials. Again, just this isn't even necessarily a list of my favorites or anything. It's just some that I think are really good that I've remembered over the years that I think are definitely worth checking out. So I hope you enjoy that. If you've got any stand-up specials you want to recommend to me, I certainly haven't seen them all. So definitely drop some suggestions for comedians I should check out or stand-up specials I should try to check out. And I don't know, maybe we'll figure out some way to make some content about stand-up again in the future. But that's it. Again, I appreciate you guys watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe, or I'll roundhouse your ass.